Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. Today's guest is Professor William Kirby, Ke Weilin. He's a former dean of Harvard College and a well-known China scholar. He spent years studying and doing research in Taiwan, and he continues to be involved with Taiwan's academic world. His latest book, Empires of Ideas, published by Harvard University, was just published in Taiwan by Lianjing 出版社顶尖大学的条件. This book examines the higher ed system in Germany, China, and the United States. We know that a nation's strength, power, and influence is directly linked to its higher ed. So let's hear from Professor Kirby. What does it take to be a world-class university and will China lead in the 21st century higher ed? Welcome, Professor Kirby.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Wenqi. Very, very great to be with you.
So there's really no one better suited than you to write this book. But can you tell us the genesis of writing a big book about what makes a world-class university? And why did you pick the three systems, German, American, and Chinese?
Well, I've been in higher education now, for nearly 40 years. And at various different types of administrative roles. And when I was dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, which includes Harvard College, but many other parts of Harvard as well, it's about half of the university, I came to know not just Harvard, but our competitors and the broader world of higher education, because it's the job of the dean to know how to keep an institution going strong. And a place like Harvard, which today has a high reputation around the world.
The best reputation continues to be, I believe.
Well, I think our reputation grows the farther away you are from Cambridge, Massachusetts.
You said about that in your book as well, yes.
but, no place stays good by staying still, by standing still. You have to constantly innovate, you have to constantly improve, and you have to study what others are doing. Mm-hmm. And that was part of my job. And I looked at what makes, for leading universities and great powers around the world as a historian. Mm-hmm. And it is absolutely true that the powers that have been the leading powers over the last several centuries, whether it's France in the 18th century, Germany and England in the 19th century, the United States in the 20th century, and possibly China in the 21st century, have also all been leaders in culture and in education. They are the places to which others wish to go to study. And Germany defined the modern university, totally redefined it in the 19th century. The Americans had a pretty good 20th century in building up large research universities. And today, no place more than the world of Greater China, not just mainland China, but also mainland China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. No place has invested more over a significant period of time in higher education. And mainland China in particular has a series of universities that are vying for global leadership.
Well, clearly our interest, especially for today's interview, is going to focus on the U.S.-China competition. Since we talk about U.S.-China competition in every possible way, we want to talk about education as well. I think you, especially when you were the dean, you did a lot of work on China, with China. And even set up, the Harvard campus in Shanghai and, various kind of collaboration. Of course, that was a very different time. The climate is very different now. But I wanted to really, ask you, what does it take to be a world-class university? And if freedom of speech and independent thinking is required, because we know that may be lacking in today's China, in mainland China. So can you just talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think you have to look at the very first research university in the world that set the standard for everybody. And that's the University of Berlin, founded in 1810. Mm-hmm. And the founder of that university, Wilhelm von Humboldt, had a series of principles on which the university would be founded. It was to be a place of open and free inquiry. Lehrfreiheit, the freedom to teach, and Lernfreiheit, the freedom to learn. It was to be a place of institutional autonomy. Even if funded entirely by the state, it would make its own decisions on whom to hire, whom not to hire, what kind of curriculum to have. It would have as its center not a professional school, but the faculty, what we would call today the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, the philosophical faculty, as it's called in German, to educate broadly students who ideally would become leading citizens of the next generation. And these and other principles have been the foundation of great universities all over the world since that time. And it's never been perfect. The idea of academic freedom, of Lernfreiheit and Lehrfreiheit. In Germany, it was not at all perfect through this period of time. There were various periods of political repression, particularly from about 1815 to the 1840s. There were some areas in which the university did not go. And in the United States, the great universities in the United States universally adopted this German model of higher education, of research universities. Chicago, Hopkins, belatedly Harvard, but also Berkeley. And they did so with varying degrees of success. But if there had been absolutely free speech in every American university, then you would not have had a free speech movement at Berkeley in the 1960s, which really fundamentally changed how undergraduates and how students could participate in political discourse, because they were highly constrained up to that point. So I should say that no one gets it right perfectly. You know, we had a lot of censorship in this country during the McCarthyite period, both from top down, but also from peer censorship. And some of that still exists today. Look at what is happening in Florida in the United States with the banning of certain books by the state.
Right. I mean, can we talk a little bit about the U.S. system now? Because I think a lot of people in Taiwan or the rest of the world are watching the changes on elite university campuses in the U.S. in just the last year or so with some curiosity and probably some surprises too. Do you think universities today actually enjoy freedom of speech?
I think they actually do. They do to a remarkable degree, probably a greater degree in many ways today than at other times in the history of modern universities. It doesn't mean that there are not constraints, which are often peer-induced constraints as to what is acceptable or what people believe, students in particular believe is acceptable in the eyes of their peers, even if they may think differently. So I remember, for example, I was giving a talk about this book when I was at Berkeley a year and a half ago. And I mentioned that, and I think this is quite true, that I reminded people that in 2013, the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party decreed that there would be 7 things you can't talk about at a university. And I said, and I've said this in China many times, a great university has to be a place where there isn't one thing you can't talk about, let alone 7. But then someone raised their hand and this woman said to me, you know, Professor Kirby, there are at least 7 things we can't talk about at Berkeley. And she's not wrong. It doesn't come from the state, however, most of the time. It comes rather from peer and other pressures. But you would be, we have here, I'm sitting in my office here in the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies here, and it's been our mission always to have diverse points of view on issues facing Greater China contemporarily or historically, and you have to work on it. There is no one politically correct truth.
Well, you mentioned, I want to talk about the 7 things that you cannot discuss, laid out by the Chinese Communist Party. Can you share what those 7 things are?
Oh, things like constitutional government, 宪政. So should the party be under the Constitution and the Constitution govern the party? The answer, of course, is no. The party is above somehow the Constitution. Civil society is another phrase that would be banned, or at least, discouraged the discussion. The early history of the party and of the disasters of the early history of the People's Republic of China, what President Xi Jinping calls historical nihilism, because it's all bad news. Those are among the kind of things that you can't talk about. It's part of a general sense of a fear of 所谓的西方化, 所谓的 westernization, and of Western ideas. And it's very ironic, since there's no idea that is more Western than communism.
It's fascinating because yeah, and because if you date it back to the May 4th movement, probably the first modern student movement in China, it was advocating for all the things that the seven no's, it's contrary to the seven things that you cannot teach. So
just that one thing on that, the great chancellor of Peking University, Tsai Ing-wen, believed that students should be educated so that they have a 世界观的教育, an education with a worldview. And he brought onto the faculty great liberals like Hu Shi, but also China's first Marxists, Li Dajiao, Chen Duxiu.
Exactly. And these were almost like
their own mind.
Yeah, the original thinkers or initiators of, the Marxism or left thinking in China. So it is quite ironic. But clearly, China has done a lot to propel its elite universities to the top tier in the world. Just in a very short time, you talk about it as well. How do they do that? And is it fair to say that they're primarily focused in the STEM fields only?
One competes in these global rankings largely by publications in international scientific journals, which are largely published in English. And so that skews some of the research, a good part of the research that universities can support in the sciences, the natural and applied sciences. That said, one should not underestimate the degree of open inquiry within a classroom or privately within the walls of a university in China. There are a lot of things that are said and discussed in those universities that are very similar to what they would be at Taida or here at Harvard on many of the same issues. It's not that everyone conforms to a certain point of view. And you've seen a great university like Tsinghua, which under the communists, it had been the greatest research university in mainland China in the 1930s. But under the communists, it became a polytechnical university on the Soviet model. But it has been reimagined not only as a great, obviously an engineering school, but a great school in the sciences, but they have restarted over the last decades their humanities, their social sciences in an extraordinary way. So
why do you think they started this humanities study?
Because they believe, and I think the leaders, if you speak to the presidents of leading mainland Chinese universities, they understand that it is not sufficient simply to educate people in today's technologies. You have to truly educate people to be independent thinkers. You have to test them and prod them. And so the idea of a liberal education, an education that liberates you from preconceived notions, is as strong in principle in China, even though people cannot always act on it, as it is anywhere in the world. And every leading Chinese university, and you've seen this in Taiwan and Hong Kong as well, every leading university in Greater China over the last 2 decades has experimented with new programs of general education. How do you educate people for the 21st century? Not simply in the latest and most recent technology. How do you educate people to be lifelong learners? Because their first job won't be their last. And And this is, every single Chinese university, whether it's Beida, for example, with its Yuan Pei program, which is one of the greatest, most demanding programs in the liberal arts anywhere in the world.
Mm.
Tsinghua University has its own, Fudan has Fudan College, and so on. Every Hong Kong university has reimagined their undergraduate education with an extra year for general education over the last 15 years. So it is something in which people believe around the world is very, very valuable.
So it is interesting. There seems to be this tension, right? There's this desire to actually cultivate a new generation of real leadership type of people in China in those university systems. But in the meantime, you have the mandate of not teaching seven things.
Right.
So that, how do you reconcile that tension? And you kind of use Nanjing University as an example. And you talk about your worry of the resurgence of political repression within the Chinese education system. Can you just say more about that?
Yeah, a little bit more about Nanjing because it matters perhaps for those with a sense of history in Taiwan, because Nanjing University, one of its predecessors was Guoli Zhongyang Daxue, National Central University, the national university under the Kuomintang's leadership in the 1920s and 1930s. And Nanjing is, of course, the former capital of the country under the national government. And as a result, it has been less trusted by the communists. And this is kind of a consistent theme. Nanjing University, nevertheless, has become a great comprehensive university. They have one of the best history departments of Chinese history, of modern contemporary Chinese history in the world, easily the best one to study 20th century China. They have a center of Republican China, of which I'm an affiliate, just extraordinary historians there. But they also, and they have idealistic students, but their students, and this is where they got into trouble, their students, like some students at Beida and at Renmin University, their students took Xi Jinping's exhortation to read Marx seriously, and they went and read the real Marx, not the Marxist textbooks of the Chinese Communist Party. And they went out and started to form labor unions in sweatshops in South China, incredibly idealistic students. And it turns out that that's not what Marxism is supposed to be about in today's China, according to the party. They were severely punished, but also the leaders, several leaders at Nanda, at Renda, and at other universities were demoted or retired because they actually admired these incredibly idealistic students. But the political pressures thereafter on Nanjing became greater. Perhaps it's because, Peking University and Tsinghua University can resist these pressures a bit more than others, but Nanjing University had to change its charter to omit references to academic freedom and bring in reverence for the teachings of the party. That's a bad sign.
Well, it's always interesting. I remember when Tiananmen happened, there's always the saying that, even though the CCP controls, most of the higher ed systems, but they've always let Beida in particular a little bit more space, and probably including Tsinghua today.
Yes.
Is that your sense as well?
It's my sense as well. And yet, Peking University students have been, you mentioned the May 4th movement, they've been causing trouble for governments ever since 1919, and they will continue to do so if given half a chance. There's no question about it.
Yeah.
So there is this fear, unleashing them, as it were, on the public. And so what I find very regrettable, if you come here to Harvard, you can just walk onto our campus and come into my office and we can chat. But recent years, Chinese universities have increased their security of who can get onto campus.
Exactly. You have to make appointments. You have to get a lot of the registration and things.
And it's
Yeah.
one of these insidious things. China has a political long COVID
Hmm.
now, it seems to me, because the restrictions on getting, you used to be able to walk onto the Tsinghua campus before COVID. Now you
Yes.
have to register with a passport or other
Yes.
ways if you're not there. Uh, but it's interesting how, Peking University is even more locked down today.
Hmm.
So if you're a young student and you're hungry for some jiaozi at either of these universities, at least at Tsinghua, the jiaozi delivery guy can get to your dorm. At Beida, they have to leave the jiaozi outside the gate
Wow.
of the
Wow.
university. You have all this rotting food outside the university. It's a sign of distrust more than anything else.
Yeah. I mean, it is fascinating how much has changed in recent years. How much do you think is related to geopolitics as well? I want to mention this because, as you said, there is this fear of Western ideas and Western thoughts penetrating Chinese society, and it's palpable, and of course, on college campuses as well. Um, and going back to how much do you think it's related to just because of the tension between US and China?
I think they're somewhat related to that, to be sure, because you have both in China and in the United States the growth, in both cases, of strong national security states
Hmm.
and a belief that national security should permeate almost every aspect of life. At least some people believe this in the United States, and some people believe this in China. And so it's difficult to argue against national security
Hmm.
as an individual citizen, and it leads to all kinds of excesses. Excesses in this country, which we've seen with the harassment of Chinese scientists,
Yeah.
and excesses in China with the harassment of people who are, they sway to Western ideas. You know,
Yeah.
the difference today between what is an international or Western idea, I define anyone to tell me in a few sentences what a Western idea is. China has a long history of internationalization. The modern China that we know today has been forged by its interaction with the rest of the world, and it has become stronger when it has interacted openly with the world, and it has become weaker when it has closed itself off
Hmm.
the world. And that is one of the things to worry about. This, national securityization of things actually does not necessarily make a country stronger. Self-isolation will always make a country weaker.
Well, that is happening in the United States as well. Of course, that's not the excuse to say China, should do that too. I do want to talk a little bit about the national security side of things because I've noticed that, even at Harvard, right, receiving any funding or doing things with China, on China has, to be scrutinized much more these days. And of course, as I mentioned very early on, sort of this university and nation linkage, and it's an interesting concept in your book as well. You talk about sort of, how government can work with universities, for various reasons, R&D and other things. And these days, in particular, there's a lot of question about sort of Tsinghua's military civil fusion programs, and they receive a lot of Chinese government support. But it shouldn't be a surprise, right, to anyone that universities work with governments on certain things. But in today's world, it's just become a liability on either side of the Pacific. How do you think about this big problem? U.S. universities used to receive so much funding from foreign donors, and now it's also become a liability almost. How,
I
how,
don't, I don't think it's a liability. We
hmm,
we wouldn't have these great centers like the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies or our other international centers without enormous amounts of support from international alumni from all over the world. We wouldn't have our program in Shanghai. We wouldn't have our new Harvard Taipei Academy also without the support of extraordinary Taiwan alumni. of Harvard. So I think it's an overstatement to say that this is shriveled to nothing. But this university, Harvard, gained enormously from its association with the United States government during and after the Second World War in particular. You know, I'm a historian
John
here.
Fairbank. Yeah.
Yeah, John Fairbank, my other mentor, Franklin Ford, and who's in German history. And virtually all of the young scholars of the Harvard History Department during the war worked for OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which is the predecessor of the CIA.
Mm-hmm.
And they did, intelligence analysis for the government when the United States was fighting on several fronts around the world. And they helped to define how Americans would later on study different areas of the world. And this marriage between government and academia, which was so powerful when there was a common cause in World War II, really fell apart, not recently, but during the Vietnam War.
Mm.
And it has been put back together to some considerable degree. There's still a lot of government support for all kinds of activities at major research universities in the United States, including national defense. But it is also much less, the relationship is more tense than it had been. When I was a student here, as a graduate student learning Chinese, I had what was called a National Defense Foreign Languages Scholarship to help me, spend extra summers learning Chinese. And that was supported by the Defense Department because they supported languages for dangerous areas.
Yes, Russian, Chinese, and a few others. Yeah.
And a few others. And so, but it's, there's what is.
But I think the mentality it is indeed a slightly different now, right? It used to be considered an asset. Maybe liability is a too strong of a word. But there is suspicion from what I'm seeing and hearing that the ties that used to be considered good and valuable are today viewed suspiciously. Is that the correct characterization, whether it's in the US or in China?
So I think actually on the part of American academics vis-a-vis their own government, they're less suspicious today than they would have been 30 years ago or 50 years ago at the height of the Vietnam War. Right after the Vietnam War, we stopped using the Reserved Officers Training Program here at Harvard to educate young officers here at Harvard. We have reinstated it today. And we have probably closer and better relations in different parts of the university with the U.S. government than we've had in some decades. What has fundamentally changed, though, in the U.S. is publicly political attitudes toward higher education. It's very easy to critique higher education as being out of touch. And
especially the elite universities and
especially, but not only. And this is the real worried thing, the most worrisome thing to me about American higher education today. 80% or more of American students get their education in public universities, great public universities like the University of California at Berkeley, University of Michigan, University of Iowa, University of Illinois. You name all of these wonderful, extraordinary places, world-class universities, every one of them. And yet, 44 out of 50 American states have disinvested in their public universities since the year 2008. And so you have a bizarre situation, and take a very good, if perhaps not world-class university, the University of Alabama. The citizens of Alabama will do and pay anything, it seems, to support the Crimson Tide, their football team.
I know.
But will they pay for new laboratories or new buildings or new dormitories? Not so easily.
Yeah.
But that's where they send their own kids.
Yeah.
And so people are disinvesting in the future of their own children when they disinvest in public higher education in the United States. But you've seen, the attacks on it constantly, usually towards state universities. the private universities, the elite private universities come in for a lot of critique, but they can handle it
Mm,
because they have their own sources of income. They have their own, they're much more autonomous. They're not perfectly autonomous, but they're much more independent in their actions.
mhm,
But the public universities are really in trouble. And
mm.
if this continues, you will see a broad decline of American higher education.
Yeah, you almost are seeing that now. I think it's probably hard for most Asian parents to understand, why the emphasis of higher ed isn't as much as, that is in Asia. And,
Yeah.
we see that, despite, and I want to shift to a slightly different topic, which is, despite the success of all these Chinese elite universities, but it seems that Chinese parents still want to send their kids to study abroad. And it's not just universities anymore. I think the last 15 years, we see, Chinese students probably make up, I don't know what's the percentage, you probably know better, what percentage of American university enrollment, but the recent trend is going to high school, private high school, boarding schools in the United States.
Yep.
I mean, what does this say about, their current Chinese education system, if it is getting better?
Well, it is true that I think more positively about Chinese higher education than many Chinese parents, many friends of mine there, and I think they underestimate the strength of China's universities, and yet at the same time, they want to provide for their children opportunities to get an education in the world as well, whether as an undergraduate or as a graduate student. They Part of it reflects a view, and there's always a lag time in reputations. So,
The ranking, yeah, yeah.
but the fact of the matter is, one of the reasons why American universities remain, I think, a magnet for talent, not just in the areas of research that matter so much, because we do have still outstanding research universities, or of the best ones in the world, but it is also because of pedagogy. If one of the weaknesses of even the greatest Chinese universities, with a few exceptions, is that teaching is not rewarded at all. Good teaching is not rewarded. And it's difficult actually in many American research universities to give proper rewards, though most of us try, to outstanding teaching and mentorship. But classes in mainland China in particular tend to be too large, tend to be more lecture, tend to be too many. Students take 7 or 8 courses a semester and so on, tend to be not interactive and challenging the students. And the teacher's student ratio is, as the massification of Chinese universities has grown, the ratio has deteriorated in terms of the capacity of a single faculty member to get to know his students. So the educational experience is really different and in many ways pedagogically stronger. It's also in the UK and Canada and elsewhere than it is at the moment in mainland China. That's one thing. The other thing is, of course, when one sends one's children abroad, you are sending them in part to be tested against the best in the world or the rest of the world, and so that they can learn in order to come back and be stronger in whatever profession they are. If you look at the business leaders of 20th century China, educated in the Republican period, many of the leading business families in China would send the next generation to the United States or to Europe or to Japan for vocational or more broad educational background, and they would come back and make a difference, an enormous difference. And it does make a difference when you have this opportunity. Just as too few American students test themselves against the rest of the world by studying abroad. It's a real weakness in the United States. Here's a good example of what an international education may do for someone. even though he was already in the United States, to be fair. But, Morris Chang of TSMC,
Yes.
one of the smartest and most interesting people I've ever met, and most successful, of course. But, born in Ningbo, eventually to the United States. But he was a Harvard freshman.
But he went to MIT later, which I know is a sore point for Harvard, probably.
Yeah, well, he told his father he wanted to be an English major, if I remember correctly. And his father told him to transfer to MIT to get a real education. But he got a little bit of both, in fact. International education can change your life. My life was changed by studying abroad. I would never be talking to you now if I hadn't studied in Europe as an undergraduate at first, and then later in China, in Taiwan. So,
I think getting that international education is considered a very valuable asset to most people in Asia. So now, the last question I really have to ask is, can China lead in higher education, in the 21st century? What is your view?
Well, leadership is comparative. So it's not absolute. There's no, if someone is rising and someone is falling, then they can assert leadership over time and set a model. Does China have a model of universities that's absolutely distinctive and will set a different model of this? I think the answer is no. They have improved on in many cases, existing international models. But the great universities of the world, whether it's Taida or Beida or Harvard or Berlin today, or Oxford or Cambridge, they are actually much more alike than they are different in what their mission is. And they have learned one from another. The greatest risk for Chinese universities is the overzealous pursuit of political correctness on the part of the state and on the part of the party. That is to say, the talent, no place is home to more extraordinary talent than mainland China because of the size, but also the quality of the educational system at every level. These are extraordinary young people. They are not, simply reduced to these stereotypes of rote learners or things of this sort. I have taught them, and they're extraordinary people when challenged to be taught. But if they are told there's only one thing you can believe or talk about, and that you have to do X or Y or Z, and in these required bishoku of Marxism, Leninism, history of the party, and so on and so forth, you can put up with this up to a time. People in Taiwan studied Sanminjuyi for decades, but it actually once that stopped, it turns out they could say what they wished. But the real danger is that you don't want great universities like the leading ones of mainland China graduating students who are just saying what they need to say in order to get through. You're graduating either cynics or opportunists, and that is not good enough for the future of China, or really for the future of higher education in the world, because China, no place is investing more in it today. No place has more to gain from it. And it just should not politically constrict it to such a degree they kill it.
Yeah, that's definitely the most fascinating topic of today. How much can Chinese government actually control its population when it's such an educated population? And, I think, most of them probably will just leave if they do not feel that, they can have that absolute freedom of thinking and, fully sort of unleash their own potential, which of course would be, a loss for China. So I hope that, they heed to your advice.
A loss for the world too.
Yes, a loss for the world as well, for sure. But like I said, I hope they heed to your advice. You've been, viewed favorably as a friend and truly, care about China. And I think most of us would like to see China, having just a better sort of population and educated population, because it only is good for the world. So I want to thank you so much for speaking to us today, Professor Kirby. And the book 顶尖大学的条件 is now available in Taiwan. You can order it online or in most bookstores. So thank you so much and take care.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Thank you very much, Wendy.